If everyone could settle down, I would like to welcome you all to Thompson Hine's 2022 Chicago Symposium. Watergate, 50 years on.
I'm not old enough.
Has the legal profession forgotten its lessons? And we will find out. Our firm is Thompson Hine. Most of you know us. We've invited you. We're a leading national full-service law firm, primarily serving the corporate and business community. My name is Frank Chaikin. I am the partner in charge of our growing Chicago office. I'm also the national practice leader for our corporate and securities practice. Come see me after the presentation. We can talk more about Thompson Hine. We opened our office here in Chicago just before COVID, and so this is, understandably, our first public event in the city of Chicago, and we're really pleased to kick it off with such a great program and with such a prominent panel. I feel like I'm going to make a T-shirt that says, "But COVID." That explains why this is our first event. But we're kicking it off with this panel with key figures from the Watergate era. I'm very excited about the program, and in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to my partner to my left, Jim Robenalt, who will introduce himself and our very distinguished panelists, Jill Wine-Banks and John Dean. John will be joining us by video. Before I turn it over to Jim, if I could please ask everyone to take a moment and silence your cell phones and devices. Also, please note that this event is being recorded, and that will be available later on. I would like to express again tremendous thanks to Jim and Jill and John in advance for the presentation, and also thank you all for coming to join us. And Jim, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is going to be a very special event. We're obviously at the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-in, June of 1972, and we have two people here who literally changed history. John is appearing in that little box down there, but we'll bring him up a little bit more to say hello. He's in his studio in Los Angeles to join us. He's been doing a lot of different things recently because of this CNN special. How many people saw the CNN special on Watergate? So a good number of you. How many of you watched Gaslit? Another good number of you. So we have John, and then we have Jill. And Jill is from here, so we're really pleased to have her here in person, but she and John are interesting to this extent. Jill is an MSNBC commentator. John is a CNN commentator. So I guess I should be a Fox commentator.
No, I wouldn't be here if you were.
So we're going to have some fun, but we got a lot to get through, because what we're going to do, since there's so much you could look at Watergate, is go back and look at 2 days. So we're going to do a deep dive into 2 days. Monday, June 19, 1972. It's the first day that John comes back to the White House after the break-in. Then Tuesday, the very next day, June 20, Richard Nixon comes back to the White House for the first time and records he has a conversation with H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, and that tape is the tape that Jill and her prosecutors subpoenaed that later had an 18-and-a-half-minute gap in it. And that's what made Jill famous, and we're going to talk about that, among other things. But these two truly changed the arc of history, and in such an important office that you could argue they changed world history. So we're really pleased to have them here, and we're going to do a number of things. If we could go to the next slide. So this is our faculty, and what I want to do is introduce them and have them introduce themselves. So John, maybe we can start with you and make sure that little mics pick up your voice.
Little mics do pick up my voice. How's it coming through?
Great, wonderful.
Good. And I like being in little boxes. Been in a little box my entire life. So there's nothing unusual today.
So, and then Jill is also here, and we're going to go to this next set. John and I have been doing continuing legal education programs since June of 2011, so 11 years ago. And we started here in Chicago at Kent Law School and then Skadden Arps, and we've gone on to do a bunch of, about 170 of these things over time. And they're really about teaching lawyers what not to do, how to stay out of trouble, and obstruction of justice and so forth. So we have done that. And Jill, on the other hand, has been quite a multimedia star. She's on MSNBC all the time, but she has this very wonderful sister-in-law's podcast. So Jill, maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Oh, I would love to. It is so much fun. I have a second podcast that I'll mention too, but this one is with three of my MSNBC legal analyst colleagues. Actually, Kimberly, who is, I don't know, to my right on my screen anyway, is actually a political analyst for MSNBC. She's on the opinion pages of the Boston Globe. Barbara McQuaid and Joyce Vance were both former U.S. attorneys in the Obama administration and are now both professors, one at Michigan, one at Alabama, and they are both MSNBC legal analysts. And we have a discussion every Friday that we release on Saturday morning and is so much fun. I think you can guess that tomorrow's conversation will not be 3 segments as it usually is. It will be one talking about whatever happens tonight. And I assume you'll all be home watching that. My other podcast is iGen Politics. It's an intergenerational show. It is with a student at UCLA who I met when he was 17 and running as a Biden delegate, as was I. And we somehow connected and have been doing this podcast. It's an interview format. And we have the most exciting and interesting guests. I'm hoping John, and hi John, I'm sorry you're not here. I thought you were going to be. And so I know my friends who are here are gonna miss you. I'm sorry about that. And if I seem nervous, it's because my friends are here. I don't usually get to do this in front of them, and it's easier to talk to, I don't know how many people watch MSNBC, but more than is in this room, but it doesn't seem intimidating. But being with my friends and being with John and being with Jim and hoping that I do good for his law firm, because they've been really wonderful in arranging this. So I thank Thompson Hine for that.
Yeah, great, thank you. So all of us have written books. John has written 14 books, I think, John, now. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the Nixon Defense, and then Jill, you can talk about the Watergate Girl.
Actually, the CLE we do came out of the Nixon Defense. I was working on a project that, had I known what I was getting into, I really wouldn't have gotten into it. It was an effort to draw a couple of Nixon's tapes out and use those to show the absurdity of the defense he relied on, that he knew nothing about the Watergate cover-up until I told him very late in the game, when I started having one-on-one meetings with him. Well, I knew that was absurd. I knew there'd be tapes that would show that. What I didn't know is that once I pulled one tape, I'd need the tape that preceded it, I'd need the tape that followed it, on through. There are roughly, nobody until I had done it had cataloged the Watergate conversations. How many did he record? Roughly 1,000, depending on how you count them. They go from just brief telephone calls to one tape runs over 8 hours. It's a tape of his listening to his conversations with me. So a tape of him listening to tapes. The only interesting part is obviously when he speaks to aides that come in between the listen. He's pretty silent when he listens to the tapes. But he actually leaves out some of the key tapes, which was interesting. Anyway, in the middle of doing this project, I said to Jim, you know, there's a lot of stuff in here that would really be interesting to lawyers if they could just hear this raw data. So I said, I get asked to, Jim had just come from a CLE on Kent State, and he said, do you ever do CLEs? And I said, I do them all the time, and they don't have a clue what to do with Watergate. So they invite me really to help draw an audience, talk about a book, sell some books, what have you, but it's really disorganized and not well done. I said, let's think about putting together a program. We did. We spent about 6 months. I made Jim listen to tapes. I made him get familiar with primary source material, not just the secondary data and reporting on it. And we came up with a program that focused on the model rules, primarily Rule 1.13. We had a wonderful guru who we have lost, a fellow by the name of Ron Rotunda, who was a leading ethicist and wrote the desk book for most lawyers for West Publication. Anyway, he helped us to form the initial program, and we are still forming that program. As Jim said, we don't know for sure, maybe 175, 185 programs. We've talked to somewhere between 75 and maybe 90,000 lawyers. So we've gotten the word across, and we're now working on our latest iteration, which this program hints at a little bit, but doesn't really, we're not there yet. We're looking at a lawyer's responsibility towards democracy. And we think it is a very important responsibility, given the fact that you can't get in the bar without pledging your support of the Constitution in every state but 3 states, we found out. But they're old states, and their state constitutions are pretty good. Massachusetts, the northeastern states don't require lawyers to pledge allegiance to the federal Constitution. Right. Anyway, cut me off, Jim.
Yeah.
Or, as you know, that's the rule of our. We use these pictures as cues.
Yeah. So that's great. So Jill I met when John and I were doing some of our programs early on here in Chicago, and I said to her, you really have got to write your book about what you did, and you were a bit reluctant to think about it, but you eventually did.
Yes.
It's an extraordinary book. How many people have read her book? I mean, just an extraordinary book, yeah. Very well done, and she tells not only her Watergate story, but also your personal story. And we talked about that, about whether it fits in or not into the book. But why don't you tell a little bit about why you wrote the book and kind of what you think the big theme of it is, and how you came up with this goofy title, The Watergate Girl.
Okay, so let me start with the title, because some of you may say, The Watergate Girl. And when my publishers suggested that, I said, absolutely not. You cannot publish my book if that's the title. And my editor said to me, what captures the era better than that? And as soon as he said that, I knew he was right. And I am totally comfortable with that title, because girl is what I was called. And so to the themes, there are 2 themes, and one of them has to do with the sexism and discrimination against women in that era. And in part, the title comes from when I first confronted my boss after being hired at the Department of Justice as a trial attorney. We all start as appellate attorneys. And it's a great way to start, because you learn the mistakes that trial lawyers make in the hopes that you won't make at least those same mistakes. But after a year, I realized that the men I started with were having trials, and I was still doing appeals. So I went to my boss, who became a character, by the way, in the Watergate, Henry Peterson, who became head of the criminal division and ended up cooperating with John. So there's another connection. And he said, well, you can't try cases. You're a girl, and you'd be much more vulnerable than the men. And I went, I don't know what you didn't notice about me, Henry, when you hired me as a trial attorney, but I want a trial. And through one of the most brilliant lawyers I've ever had the privilege of knowing, some of you may remember him as Clinton's counsel during the impeachment hearings. He was White House counsel. Charles Ruff, said he had a trial coming up, which was in Alaska. And I guess they felt, okay, it's Alaska, so they let me go and second chair that. And I will say, back then, this was in 1970, no woman could wear pants in court. That was absolutely forbidden. So here I am in January in Alaska, it's 30 below zero, and I'm wearing a skirt while the jurors are all wearing flannel-lined pants. So talk about some of the, I was more vulnerable, I guess Henry was right about that. So it covers that, but it also covers a time when democracy worked, when there was bipartisanship, when the media believed in the facts and people believed in the media. And so justice prevailed. And I fervently hope that we could get back to a time when justice prevails, and look forward to tonight's hearings, of course, as part of that effort to show the full scope of the threat that our democracy faced. And so I think those are the two examples. I do not mention Donald Trump, although the book came out in February 25th of 20. So you know what that meant to my book tour. I had a very abbreviated book tour because of COVID, but it never mentioned him, even though things by then were quite obvious. But I think that if you read the book, you will see the parallels without my ever having to point them out. I do talk about in the epilogue, I do talk about the parallels, and they're pretty obvious, though, while you're reading the book without having them pointed out to you.
Yeah. So my book, January 73, is what the subtitle says. In this 1 month, Watergate, the Watergate trial, Roe v. Wade was decided, Vietnam, the war ended for us, and it was the month that changed America forever. On one day, January 22, 1973, Henry Kissinger comes into the Oval Office. Of course, everything is taped. He's about to fly off to Paris to end the war for us in Vietnam. 2 hours later, Harry Blackstone comes out at the Supreme Court and announces Roe v. Wade. And 4 hours later, Lyndon Johnson drops dead in Texas. So it's this extraordinary time where there was a big turning point for us. And of all things, it's all coming round right now with Roe, obviously, and with Watergate at 50. So maybe my next book will be June 2022, the month that changed history. John has this extraordinary special on Watergate, and we were invited to come last week in Washington, where Jim Acosta interviewed John after we saw the very first iteration of the documentary. And I'm telling you, it is fantastic. It moves, it's got energy. Jill, you saw it, and I think you liked it too.
I've recommended it to everybody.
Yeah, and then of course, John is also being portrayed in Gaslit with his wife, Mo, who, by the way, he is still married to. They're going to celebrate their 50th anniversary this October. And normally when I say that, people applaud. This is a picture of Mo at the time, and this is the woman playing her. I think that's pretty good. Mm-hmm. John, I'm not going to ask you to comment on Gaslit because you're not watching it, right?
I'm not watching it. I actually this is a small town I live in. I got the script early and I had Mo read the script, and she said, you're going to be pretty amazed at the way they introduce your character. You're with a black prostitute who has encyclopedic knowledge of the Nixon administration. And she said, did that happen ever? I said, never. And I raised it with Leonard Niflek, who is the original producer of the series that this is based on, The Slow Burn. And Leonard said, let me check. I just can't believe that. And he came back to me and said, yeah, they've changed all that. What I've learned later is they made it a white prostitute rather than a black one.
Yeah. John's not happy with it. It actually is interesting in that, and Jill's not happy with it either for John's sake.
I think it unfairly portrays John, not accurately at all.
But it does.
I'm glad that Mo is a hero. Mo is. I think she's the hero of the whole story.
Yeah, she is the hero of the whole story. So this is you. Why don't you talk about your film project with Katie Holmes?
So that's me and Katie. That's me at the time.
With your Walter Mondale button on.
I know that. I don't know when that picture was taken. Obviously, I was campaigning for Carter Mondale at the time, and she has optioned my book and is working on a script with some really good people, and we'll see what happens. I don't know. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, you're going to be at. They're going to do a ceremony in the Senate room where John testified on the 17th, the anniversary.
Next, a week from Friday. It's a major event, and I just learned they're having me moderate a panel with, for example, my closest partner in Watergate, Richard Benveniste. who is fortunately in the Caribbean and doesn't yet know this, because I know he's going to be very unhappy that I'm moderating and he's not, but we'll have to wait and see.
But you're going to
I want to go back to one thing, because saying Rick's name reminded me. You mentioned that I tell my personal story, not just the Watergate story. And I want to say that all of my Watergate colleagues, but very vociferously, Rick said, "You cannot do that, do not do it." And my publisher, of course, said, "You absolutely must. And just write the truth. And don't worry about if your ex-husband, your first husband, is going to sue you. We'll worry about that. Just write it as true and let the lawyers tell you what you can and can't say." And the reason that I included it is because I believe that it is pretty much a universal issue, that wasn't just me who was in a bad marriage and stayed because in those days divorce wasn't common, and because women, we took the responsibility. If it's failing, it must be my fault. And I felt it was an important story to tell for the purposes of other women, and to show that if I could overcome it, everybody can overcome it. And so that's why the personal story is
Yeah,
included.
and I think it ended up working out very well. I wasn't sure either. But so this is what 50 years ago, this security guard, Frank Wills, who's now being recognized in the Gaslit series, this is his writing. And you can see there at 1:47 a.m. on June 17, call police, found tape on the door. So that was kind of the thing. And then they found these burglars in the Watergate with $100 bills on them. All the serial numbers matched. And, they had their gloves and they had film. And this was not your normal burglary. These are the 5 that were arrested. They are, the guy second in from the left is James McCord, who is a former CIA guy who was the guy who was planting the bugs. The other guys are all Bay of Pigs, Cuban Americans who were working with Howard Hughes, CIA guy. Howard Hunt, yeah, Howard Hughes. And this is John
Maybe
back.
him too.
John back at the time, and this is Jill back at the time. And the one thing you'll notice is she's got a pin on. She's very famous these days for Jill's pin, and you've got one.
It used to be that my pins were just pretty, things that I just liked as accessories. Now they have to have a message. The pin I'm wearing today actually was a gift from the Watergate Hotel, which hosted one of my early book events. And it says 1973 and the Watergate Girl, and has the hotel logo on it. So it sort of seemed appropriate for this audience.
Yeah. So the pictures of you back then will come back to when you got into the true limelight of everything. So here's what we're looking at. We're looking at these 2 days. You can see that Saturday is when the arrests happen, early in the morning. These guys go to jail. John, you are in the Philippines, conveniently enough. You're out of the country. You're over in the Philippines, and you then come back. Maybe you can describe briefly what happened in that return trip and why you were there.
Let me first focus on the fact that we're looking at 2 days. There are about over 900, close to 1,000 days of scandal. And it is much more than a bungled burglary and a cover-up that followed it. That's really become nothing but the trigger for a subject matter, a word that most people know and don't necessarily associate with the hotel. So our focusing down on just this very narrow period is just to talk about what did trigger the scandal. It goes on and on and on. One of my missions in my testimony, for example, was very little about Watergate and the break-in, because I knew very little about it, but rather the context in which it happened. And that's how you have to understand the Nixon presidency, understand why he got in the trouble he got into, and understand why Watergate could occur. But on June 19th, I had actually returned late on the 18th from the Philippines. I'd been giving a speech in Manila. I stopped in San Francisco, called my deputy and told him I was going to stay in San Francisco. And he said, John, your predecessor, John Ehrlichman, who was White House Counsel before me, he's looking for you. There's been some sort of incident over at the Democratic National Committee. Well, so I got on a plane and came back home and went in the office the next morning, and let's flip the
Well,
the
we'll come
dial.
back. We'll come back to that.
Oh,
Just
you don't want.
Hold that thought. I just wanted to get you from the Philippines back to Washington.
For a change, you're in control.
It's good. So then the next day is Jill's day. This is the 18-and-a-half-minute gap happens the next day. It's extraordinary that these two important events. These are some of the people we're talking about here. John Ehrlichman up in the left corner. As John said, he was White House counsel before John then became chief domestic advisor. Chuck Colson is a guy who was, Nixon hatchet man?
Pretty much.
You got to know him during the time that the trials. Haldeman was the chief of staff. He had that haircut that he was famous for, but he was Mensa smart. He kept notes, and we're going to talk about some of those notes and listen. The only audio we have for you today is an audio of him talking about that 18-and-a-half-minute gap day, what he said for that day, which we think is kind of newsy.
It's great, and it is definitely news. This is breaking news, folks.
Yeah, and then at the bottom is John Mitchell, better known as Martha Mitchell's husband, and Jeb Magruder is in the middle there. He was the deputy director of the campaign, and then John down in that corner. So those are some of the main characters, and of course, we couldn't leave out this guy, everybody's favorite, Gordon Liddy, so this is Jill. Now, one of the reasons we're going to talk about the 18-and-a-half-minute gap, and Jill cross-examines the president's secretary, Rosemary Woods. But when they took pictures of her outside the White House as she finished that, they always took full-length pictures of you. Why don't you talk about that?
So if we're talking about sexism, also I want to note I am wearing a pin in that picture too. Headlines always read, Jill Wine-Vollner, my first husband's name, today wearing, and it would describe me, or headlines read, mini-skirted lawyer today said, and it always was, obviously it was offensive and horrible and terrible to live through. I would go into court and someone would say, whose secretary are you? Because statistically that was more likely to be the case than that I was actually representing one of the litigants. So I had one funny experience back here. Those of you who are from Chicago, I'm sure know Mike Royko's name. And when I first became head of the executive director of the American Bar Association, we actually have a former president of the American Bar Association here, Laurel Bellows, raise your hand. The office had moved from the University of Chicago to Northwestern, right on Lakeshore Drive, but it was on a high-rise building, and the staff was feeling discombobulated because they weren't all in one place, and they felt they didn't like it. And so my head of HR said, you should really try and host some kind of a brown bag lunch where everybody would be together, and you'll need a good speaker to attract the audience. So I thought I did a survey. Mike Royko was unanimously selected as the person they wanted to hear. So I bravely called him, cold call to someone I didn't know, and he answers the phone, well, someone answers the phone, and I said, I'm Jill Wine-Banks. I'd like to talk to Mr. Royko. And the voice goes, hey, Mike, there's some broad on the phone who wants to talk to you. And in retrospect, I know it was him. But then this other person gets on, and I ask him, he says, I write a few thousand words a day, and that's all I'm good for. I can't do a speech. I said, please, it would really mean a lot to me. He agrees to do it. I'm nervous he's not going to show up, but he does. And he starts his speech by saying, I don't do speeches, and I'm only here because Jill Wine-Banks asked me. And she personally changed American history, and I want to tell you how she did that. And he pulls out from under the podium a stack of photographs, all of them full-length pictures of me, and he says, there was this break-in, nobody paid any attention to it, until some photo editor figured out how to get attention. And he holds up these pictures. So first I'm feeling really proud. He said I changed history. My new staff is going to love me. And then I'm sliding under the table in humiliation. So that's sort of the story of how I came to be known as the mini-skirted lawyer. There is a good part of this, which is it did let my current good husband, Michael Banks, see me in the newspaper. And he had been my high school boyfriend. And when he contacted me, We ended up meeting. In fact, at this club, he went to Cambridge, and the Oxford-Cambridge boat race dinner was held here, and I was visiting Chicago, and the dinner was here, and we had our first date and got married very shortly after that.
And are still happily married.
And 42 years later, we're still together and happy, and so,
There
yeah.
you go. You get the applause right away. That's because she's here, John. That's
I understand.
So what she did, and we're going to come to it, but what she did was on the covers of Time and Newsweek. It was called the Rosemary's Stretch or Rosemary's Boo Boo, which
I forgot my evidence pictures I was going to bring.
you were going to bring it, yeah. So we're going to come back to that, and then if we have time at the end of this, we end this program at 5:30. We're going to talk about indicting Richard Nixon because Jill was involved in that. John has opinions about it. Of course, Ford pardoned him, and he wasn't indicted. And the question we're going to ask is, was that the right thing for the country? Especially in hindsight today, as we think about it, and you look at these memos that were created by Jill's team, what's called the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, you see this starts, in our view, there is clear evidence that Richard M. Nixon participated in a conspiracy to obstruct justice. So they felt pretty strongly he should have been indicted, and was history damaged by the fact that Ford pardoned him and that there was an indictment? If we have time, we'll come back to that at the end of the program.
The answer is yes.
Yeah, the answer is yes. So now we'll let John describe what he did on June 19. This is his first day we want to talk about. Monday, June 19, we've got him back from Manila. This is actually is it your handwriting, John, or your secretary's handwriting?
No, it's my secretary's.
Yeah, who kept, who called John throughout that day. And what's really interesting is some of these characters who called him, and we'll talk briefly about them, but Jack Caulfield, Jeb Magruder, we showed you his picture. J.E. is John Ehrlichman, Gordon Strawn, another person, Chuck Colson, and then John's box is over Gordon Liddy. And we're going to spend most of our time talking about that. But John, maybe talk about what you did that day. You kind of went around the White House taking everybody's confession as a lawyer, and that's how we do our CLE, what were his legal obligations. But talking to everybody about what happened here and
When you do a CLE with an able trial lawyer like Jim, soon he knows every joke you'll tell, every line you'll give, and I'd like to hear you do it, Jim.
Yeah.
Let me go back a slide to the call sheet. One more.
That is to see the whole thing. I got you.
Yeah. It's a busy day. It's a typical day. And one of the wonderful things is having the archival record of Watergate that exists. In fact, the archival record is so large of Watergate that researchers are really intimidated about it or lazy about it. There's some books out that are coming out for the 50th anniversary. They're people who've done nothing but read secondary source material, but they don't want to dare tackle the primary source material. So they're rehashing and sometimes bringing forward the old material. This call sheet, the first thing that flashed on me was the Jeb Magruder call, where he called that morning of the 19th. He had been hailed back to Washington from a fundraiser in California by Bob Haldeman, the chief of staff, to get a look and find out what was going on and report back to him. And Jeb called me and said, "John, you need to talk to Gordon Liddy because I can't." I said, "What do you mean I need to talk to him, and why can't you?" He said, "Well, he's responsible for the arrests at the Watergate where some of his men were arrested, and it's a disaster. The reason I can't talk to him is I think he'd like to kill me. A couple of weeks ago, we were at the elevator at the Re-election Committee, and I put my hand in a very friendly gesture on his shoulder and said, "Gordon, I need a memo of whatever it was sooner rather than later. Can you please get it to me?" And he said that, Jeb said to me, he said, "Liddy brushed my hand off his shoulder and squinted his eyes at me and said, "Jeb, if you ever touch me again, I'll rip your arm out of your body and beat you to death." And he said, "John, I think he was serious." So that's why I can't talk to him, and I'd like you to talk to him and find out what's going on. Anyway, I did do that, so let's go forward.
Okay.
Can I interrupt for one
Yeah,
second to
go
talk
ahead.
about Jeb Magruder? He was one of my witnesses for the trial, so I got to know him and his wife Gail very, very, very well. And my opinion of him is so low that it cannot go any lower. He was completely amoral. He could not take responsibility for anything. And I just want to give you an example.
Therefore, he became a minister later in his life.
He did become a minister, that's true. He also, I would have said that he had a great relationship with Gail, and I would have been wrong because they got divorced. But I'll just give you one example of what I saw. As I was preparing him for trial, he, like John, had already been sentenced and was in jail, but he was brought to D.C. because that's where I was, and he was brought in for the first day of prep, and he sits down at my desk, and he bursts into hysterical sobbing. And I don't mean just crying, I mean heaving, and he can't talk. And I'm thinking, Jeb, what's wrong? What's wrong? And the only thing I could think of was he had spent the night in the DC jail and that he had been assaulted and raped. And I knew, and this is one of those things where sometimes your gender does make a difference. I felt there's no way in the world Jeb would ever confess that to me, or almost to anybody. So I went to get Tony Passaretti. I don't know if you remember Tony, John, who was an IRS agent who worked for us, who was like the father figure of the office. He was much older than us, and he and his wife would invite the youngsters over for dinner frequently. And I said, Tony, you have to get in there and find out what's wrong. So what do you think was wrong? The lights were left on all night. There was television going. He couldn't sleep. And that's what caused him to be hysterical sobbing. It resulted, of course, in my having him moved to Fort Halliburton, which was a facility where we could keep prisoners, where he would not be subjected to the DC jail. But that's the type of person he was.
Yeah.
So just need to put him in context.
That's Jeb with his
Jeb,
hand
yeah,
over.
yeah.
He might have been in hysterics then. And these are some of the other characters, Colson and Strawn, which we don't need to talk about. So let's get to the Liddy conversation, John. You've been asked to talk to him. Why don't you tell us what happened?
Gordon didn't have a mustache at the time when he worked at the White House, Nixon White House, and then later at the Re-election Committee. The day I called him over to come over to my office, I intercepted him, realizing he might not be somebody I want in the White House complex. And so before he got to my office, but inside the building, because he still had a pass, I said, let's walk down 17th Street, which is the main street that goes between the Executive Office Building and the rest of Washington. It's sort of the outer rim of the west side of the White House grounds. So we walked down towards the Corcoran Art Gallery, and he begins immediately. Well, first what struck me is he looked like he'd been sleeping in the seersucker suit he was wearing. It was dirty, it was wrinkled, it was not the crisp Gordon Liddy that I'd become accustomed to. So I knew he was in deep trouble, and he was trying to confess to me immediately. He said, John, this is all my fault. I said, well, tell me what happened. He said, because I didn't at that point have any more knowledge than what I'd been able to read on the front page of the Washington Post about the arrest at the Watergate. He said, well, they're my men. It's my fault for hiring Jim McCord, who was the security chief at the Re-election Committee. But he said, Jeb Magruder cut my budget so badly, I had to make up and find somebody who could do it on the cheap for me. It was a mistake. And he said, there's one problem though, a serious problem I've got to tell you about. He said, two of the men that I used at the Watergate are men I used when I worked at the White House in a national security operation I undertook for Ehrlichman. He said, are you aware of it? I said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, well, I when Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, that study of the origins of the war in Vietnam that had been gone over by the Defense Department and a number of think tanks, excuse me, he said, we were missioned to find out everything we could about Ellsberg. When he wouldn't talk, and his psychiatrist wouldn't talk to the FBI, we made a decision. We had to go in and find out what was going on. And so we broke in that office. And two of the men I used in that break-in are now in the DC jail. He said, I don't think they'll talk, but you've got to get all those people out of jail. I said, well, Gordon, I don't know about that. We walked on down, and he told me more of the details. That this was a second entry, why they'd gone into the Watergate. And as I returned, I realized the guy's radioactive. I wanted to get away from him as soon as I could. So I started back up 17th Street, and he said, there's one more thing. I said, I want you to know that I understand if you want to take me out. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, just don't do it at my house. I've got young children. I wouldn't want them to see a bloody thing or somebody get injured because of me. He said, but you just tell me which street corner and what night to be on that street corner here in Washington, and I'll be there. I said, well, after I absorbed what he was telling me, I said, Gordon, I don't think we're there yet. It's one of those things I've reflected on over the years and wondered if he wasn't right. But anyway, I went back and immediately reported what he had told me to John Ehrlichman. And one of the interesting things about Ehrlichman is how cool he was about my learning that he had authorized a break-in into Daniel Ellsberg, because Lydia had clearly identified him. And at that time, I told Ehrlichman, I said, listen, John, I have no background in the criminal law. Nobody in my office has any background in the criminal law. And we're going to make a mistake if we don't get somebody in there who knows what we should and should not do. And he just dismissed that right away. He said, we're not going there. We're not going to have any of those kinds of problems. You just buckle up and we'll proceed with this thing. So that was the first really bad mistake I made, is not pushing to get a criminal lawyer. Might have reached out to the Department of Justice for somebody like Jill Vollner.
Exactly. So that is kind of the conclusion of that first day. And we've built a whole CLE around this day and this week of what is a lawyer's obligation when he finds out clients are committing crime or fraud, and that it's ongoing, and how it changed our legal rules. Model Rule 1.13 is organization is client, and you're supposed to report up the chain, and if you can't, then you can go beyond the attorney-client privilege and report out in most states. So that we built that around that. So later that night, Richard Nixon returns to the White House. How do we know that? Well, there's just so many extraordinary records with the presidency. This is Richard Nixon's daily diary. And you can see it's June 19th, so it's, Monday at 7:26 p.m. And it's the place the day began was in Key Biscayne, because Nixon had been in the Bahamas, came back to Miami, stayed there through Monday, flew back Monday night from Florida, and you can see he flew on the Spirit of 76, the presidential plane, and at 10:06 finally is back in the residence that night. So I want to show you this too, because when we hear this audio from Haldeman, he mentions that he talked with the president on the plane ride back about Watergate. So that's some news here that, that nobody knew if they actually talked about it until...
Jim, let me add another footnote to that document. One of the things that's going to come up in the June 6th hearings is that some of the records are missing for the Trump administration, and it's these daily diaries where 7 hours on June 6th is apparently missing. These documents are prepared by the National Archives. What happens is the archivist sends over somebody who is actually on the staff at the White House, who collects from secretaries, Secret Service agents, builds a whole network so that the archives can know where the president is, literally down to the minute. And they're highly reliable. No reason for anyone to distort this. But this may become an issue in the forthcoming June 6 hearings.
January 6th.
And let me add one other thing, which is that these were crucial pieces of evidence for us. They were very helpful to have. This is one of the ways when we found out that there were tapes that we were able to identify precisely what tapes we wanted. We could look at who did the president meet with, what did he do next, what might have happened on that day. And their absence is highly suspicious from the Trump administration.
Right. So this is the presidential plane. This is actually when Nixon went to China, but to give you an idea of what he came back on. And then this next day, this is where the 18.5-minute gap is. It's during this period where Nixon meets with Haldeman in the executive office building. And by the way, if you want to ever get into this, the Nixon tapes are online at the Nixon Library. You can go listen to these tapes yourself. The EOB is more difficult to hear because it's a bigger room than the Oval Office, but this is back to this presidential diary. So we know that on this day, this Tuesday, that Nixon met with Haldeman from 11:26 to 12:45. And as Jill said, this document helped them pinpoint a tape they wanted to ask for. Because when they asked for tapes, they didn't want to do a shotgun, they wanted to do a rifle shot, because this is the president, it's extraordinary, it doesn't happen very often, and Archibald Cox, your boss, wanted to be very precise about asking for this. So this is a picture of Haldeman with Nixon in the Oval Office, and this gives you an idea of how big the executive office building was, this office. And you also see there's an elephant that is a clock on and it was going tick, tick, tick the entire time too, so you have to listen through that. All right, so what did they talk about? If there's an 18.5-minute gap on that tape, which there turned out to be, why did somebody erase it? So here's where we make a little news, I think. These are Haldeman's notes. Everybody knew he took notes. Everybody knew that this was from this meeting. You can see up in the left corner, 6:20, so this is the June 20, 11:30, and his EOB, is the executive office building. This is the way Haldeman kept his notes, and when he kept these notes, it was really kind of a checklist of things. It wasn't a transcript of what they talked about. It was a checklist of things he had to think about and take care of and so forth.
Follow up.
Yeah, and then somebody would, look. So we know about these notes. What we really haven't focused on is Haldeman dictated his diary that night. So we have a tape. It's not the tape that was erased, but we have a tape, and it's Haldeman's diary. And we're going to listen to that in just a second here. But this is what when they got back into the Watergate thing, as he says, what is the counterattack? PR offensive to top this. So Jill, I showed you, or I shared with you that you can get this Haldeman diary entry for that night, and your reaction was wow when you listened to it. So when you listen to this, you're going to hear a couple things. He's going to talk about what had led to these notes and what he had been doing right prior to this meeting, including with John Dean. And then he begins, you can tell he's just reading these notes. And so what Haldeman did every night is he went home, and John, what did he have? Was it a cassette recorder?
It's a small, narrow, very expensive at the time recording device that had many reels in them, little micro reels they called them. And what he's doing is using his notes to trigger his memory of the events of the day. But as you noted, the notes are primarily what he's got to follow up on and what needs further attention. But he extrapolates. The oral recording of this, to me, drives home the point that there was pure accidental what was erased from that conversation, rather than really done to try to remove evidence.
Okay. Jill will disagree with that.
I will disagree with it, and is this a good time to set maybe a context for these notes?
Yes, go ahead.
So we had these notes at the time of the tapes hearing, when we knew about the tapes and when they admitted in bad trial strategy, first that there were 2 missing, we have a hearing, and sort of nothing suspicious appears. They said 1 wasn't recorded, because it was from the residence, which wasn't on the taping system, and one was a malfunction of the switching from one machine to the other when the tape ran out. That hearing ends, and the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, they come back and say, oh, we just found one that has an 18.5-minute gap. So we went from 9 to 7, and now to 6, sort of one that we can have the tape, but it doesn't have the conversation we had asked for. And it became very important in my questioning of Rosemary Woods to have this, because it does show that they talked about Watergate. And that the part of the tape, because if you go to the page 1, you can see that you don't have to change the slide, but
I will.
I'm telling you, the conversation that preceded it is the last thing that is on the tape until the 18-minute gap. And then it picks up again after the conversation about Watergate. So there's a specific erasure that coincides with the discussion of Watergate. To me, there's no question of that. And that became very important in questioning Rosemary Woods, which I assume we'll talk about later.
We're going to talk about
skip
So
that.
listen to this. You're literally going to be in Haldeman's office in his home as he's, right before he goes to bed, he would do this every night, religiously dictate his diary. So this is him, and you'll see he talks initially, then he gets to these notes.
But importantly, listen to what he adds. Listen to what he adds to what's in these notes.
Okay. Oops, let me go back. I think I have to go back one more to then make it work. Okay.
No, forward, that's it.
Yeah.
We got back into the Democratic break-in again. I told the president about it on the plane last night, and he was somewhat interested. The more he thought about it, it obviously bothered him more because he raised it in considerable detail today. I had a long meeting with Ehrlichman and Mitchell, into which we added Kleindienst for a little while and John Dean for quite a while. Conclusion was that we've got to hope that the FBI doesn't go beyond the necessary in developing evidence, and that we can keep a lid on that, as well as keeping all the characters involved from getting carried away with any unnecessary testimony. The president was concerned about what our counterattack is, our PR offensive to top this. He feels that we've got to hit the opposition with their activities. Also put out the point that the libertarians have created public callousness. Do they justify this kind of thing less than stealing the Pentagon Papers or the Anderson files and so on? Feels we should be on the attack for diversion and not just take it lying down. He raised it again several times during the day, and it obviously is bothering him. He had Colson over to talk about it, and then later called me a couple of times on various specifics. He called at home tonight saying he wanted to change the plan for his press conference and have it on Thursday instead of tomorrow, so that it won't look like he's reacting to the Democratic break-in thing. Also, so as to give the McGovern New York primary story a better ride tomorrow. So we're juggling the schedule all around to work that out. End of June 20th.
All right, so there's your tape for what they talked about.
Well, and what it shows, that first line, is that they talked about it on the plane yesterday. And if you remember, the president has always said he didn't know about it until John told him basically in March about it. Well, in March of the next year, on June 19th, this is proof that he actually had a discussion about it, was concerned about it, knew about it, was already saying, let's make sure the FBI doesn't proceed too much, let's keep a lid on it. It's pretty dramatic new stuff.
So how did we get to this point where we knew about tapes? Because when John Dean testified in June of 1973, and by the way, John Lennon and Yoko Ono came to hear him testify. There's a picture of them coming in and sitting like every other. And John, you didn't know about that until we did our CLE.
No, I've never been to a concert by the Beatles, but they did hear me sing.
Do you notice how I set that up? So in any event, you know, that when John testifies, he doesn't know there's a taping system, but he suspected he was taped in one conversation. And a couple weeks later, they talked to Alexander Butterfield. Very few people knew about the taping system. It was a real secret. John didn't know it, Henry Kissinger didn't know it, Ehrlichman didn't know it, and the people who knew it were the people who had to take care of it, like Butterfield and some of the Secret Service people, and Haldeman did know. So, but they were interviewing the Senate staff, Alexander Butterfield, and they said, John Dean said that he was taped in this one conversation. Is that possible? Literally, like 2 hours later in the interview, they come back to it. And Butterfield said to his wife that morning, man, if they ask me about this, I'm just going to have to tell the truth. And he did. And he said, well, yes, he probably was taped, and Nixon taped everything. And this was Friday, July 13th, 1973, a bombshell. John was brought back by Sam Dash, who was the Senate guy, to say to him, that Nixon taped everything, because they wanted to see if he was going to smile or not when he found out.
Well, you know what? It's deeper than that, Jim. Sam Dash was worried that they'd been set up. He didn't know Butterfield from Adam, and he had just gotten caught in their dragnet, if you will, and they'd ask him the right question, and it seemed a little strange to them that maybe this was a plant, and this whole thing would undercut my testimony, and that he'd relied on and built his hearings on. So that's why he calls me back, and desperate to get my reaction, brings Jim Hamilton with him to my house and to see what my reaction is. And of course, I'm thrilled to learn there's a taping system. And of course, at that time, I also knew if there wasn't a bonfire on the South Lawn, that was the end of the Nixon presidency.
Yeah, and you preceded James Comey in saying, Lordy, there are tapes. But in any event, so this happens on a Friday. You guys are full at work at this point, and by the 16th, Alexander Butterfield, who recounted this when we did a program with him out in Chapman in 2012, Butterfield testifies, yes, there were tapes. This is on Monday. And why don't you pick that thread up? What happened with your Watergate Special Prosecution Force? And remember, Archibald Cox, Harvard Law professor, has been made special prosecutor, runs the office. Maybe talk a little bit about that office, Archibald, and then what the reaction to this tape is.
I will, but I actually am noticing, Christy, look at the pin. Anyway, we were both thrilled and frightened because we also knew, one, we had to subpoena those tapes. Two, we would have to carefully select them to make sure that we only selected ones that would be within the crime fraud exception so that there wouldn't be any executive privilege claims. And three, we knew that if let's go backwards. John testified not knowing that there were tapes. So now we were going to find out how accurate was his memory. He also was escorted out. He was fired, whereas Ehrlichman and Haldeman were allowed to resign. He didn't gather his materials and collect all his files. So he was testifying from what is, by any standard, an amazing memory. Obviously, there's room for mistakes in that. And we knew that it was his word against the president's until there were tapes. And that if the tapes undermined John in any way, it was going to very much hurt our case. So we were very concerned, but we were also very excited because we believed that everything John was telling us was true, everything he had testified to. There's also a funny bit when he's saying that he thought he might have been taped. There's one tape that we didn't use in the trial, but it's where there's a discussion in which the president says, you don't think John is taping us, do you? And the end conclusion is, nah, he wears those tight Italian suits. We'd spot a wire if he was wearing one. So they're taping themselves talking about, is John taping us? And I found that amusing. Anyway, we were very much elated, and it only took us a few days to put together a subpoena, which included the 9 tapes, the first of which is the June 20th tape. And that will become important. This is Rick and I going into court. But here's the subpoena. And I don't know if you have the one that shows the actual content, signed by Archie Cox. And if you look at it, the first one is the meeting of June 20th. And We didn't know exactly what was on that because, of course, Haldeman and Ehrlichman weren't telling us. The president wasn't telling us. Most of the calls were identified through John. That's how we picked March 21st, for example, the famous Cancer on the Presidency speech. And it became really important, obviously, later when we had the missing hearing. That wasn't one of the ones that was missing in the first tapes hearing. So what else do you want to know?
All right, so you send this off, and this begins a real, it's not a constitutional crisis, but it really is a question of whether or not a criminal investigation, somebody could subpoena the president.
Yes.
And so you have Sirica as your lawyer, or as your judge, and he rules in your favor.
Yeah.
He originally rules that they should come to him, and then later the Court of Appeals says, you guys get them.
Yeah.
And so you're in the process of thinking you're going to get these things. And during this process, the Court of Appeals says to you, try to compromise. See if you can compromise in some way. And so Rosemary Woods begins to type up transcripts.
And notice she's wearing a pin.
And she's typing up the transcripts, listening to these very difficult tapes. And the compromise would be that they would give the transcripts to you all, not the tapes, and then have some deaf senator listen to the tapes and confirm them. But this is going on during this period of time when they think they're going to get this stuff. And lo and behold, Nixon has had it with Archibald Cox. Describe Cox a little bit about who he was and your reaction to him.
Cox is one of the most moral and intelligent people you could ever meet, a kind and gentle person.
Tall, too. 6'4".
Very tall, very tall. He was a Harvard law professor before and he had also been Solicitor General of the United States.
For the Kennedy administration.
For the Kennedy administration, which was one of the points that the Nixon administration hated him for because of the association with Kennedy, as you might imagine, since Nixon lost to Kennedy originally. But he was a person who really cared about the moral character of people and who would not negotiate when he was right. And that's sort of what happened here, where the Stennis compromise. Senator Stennis had been mugged and injured and was partially deaf, and he was supposed to listen to the tapes and confirm that the transcripts, which would be very suggestive, would be accurate. And this is actually what led to the October 20th press conference, which led to the Saturday Night Massacre. And the reason it happened is John Dean pled guilty on October 19th, which was a Friday, and this was going on at the same time, the negotiations about the tapes. And our press officer said, you know, the best way to do this is to show the American people why you have a right to the tapes and why you need the tapes. And one of the most dramatic and wonderful tape recordings or videos is the press conference by Archibald Cox. His character comes through in that wonderfully. And
it is the morning of October 20th.
First of all, it's a Saturday, which is unusual that you would do a Saturday press conference, but the time was ticking. We were waiting for the tapes. The White House was now stonewalling, and I will get to what my theory is on why that happened. I sat at the press conference and was supposed to leave for New York right after it, and I said to my team, I can't leave. And everybody said, what could happen? It's a Saturday in Washington. Go to the wedding in New York. You'll be back on Sunday anyway. Big deal. So I flew to New York, came back to my hotel very late at night, and the desk clerk ran from behind the counter to hand me a message from George Frampton, one of my teammates, who said in the message, the FBI has seized our offices, return immediately. And this is the days before there were cell phones. I had no idea what had happened, that Cox had been fired after the Attorney General was fired, after the Deputy Attorney General became the acting and got fired, and then Bork, who was a Solicitor General, became the acting, and he fired Cox. And it wasn't clear whether our entire office had been fired or whether it was just Cox who had been fired. Obviously I flew back immediately, and the discussion was, do we quit in protest if we haven't been fired? But have we been fired? How do we find out if we've been fired? So it was quite a dramatic time. 3 days later.
Literally with FBI coming in and taping
they
everything.
taped our office. I went to get some personal stuff out of my desk, which meant removing evidence tape, and an FBI agent said, I wouldn't do that, ma'am. So, I mean, it was really horrible. We sat in a conference room. We debated whether we should quit in protest. Archie Cox was still in town and said, absolutely not. Don't give them what they want. If you haven't been fired and you can still do your job, then you have to stay and do it. You know more than anyone else, and it would only allow them to. It turned out we had been transferred to the Department of Justice, which was the same thing as firing us, since the department was led by the Nixon administration. But because of public reaction, and that's important, the public reaction was so strong, and in those days there was no email. We were getting telegrams, if anybody remembers what a telegram is, and there were canvas sacks of mail, you know, the kind of big sacks like this, that just flooded our office and the White House as well, showing support for us and condemning Nixon for doing this. And 3 days later, he did a U-turn. He said, I made a mistake. I'm going to appoint a new special prosecutor. I still wonder why not bring back the one who was still in Washington, who we all loved and adored and admired and respected. Why not bring back Cox? But he didn't. And I will give you the tapes. So now, on October 23rd, we are now again waiting for the tapes, and waiting and waiting and waiting until the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, so less than a month later, we find out that there's this third 18-minute gap.
Yeah, so the reaction does result from this firing.
And the haircut is the only thing that he shares in common with Haldeman.
So we have a first round of tape hearings because the White House has to say before they turn all this stuff over, well, as Jill said, we're missing one recording that was late on the 20th, a phone call from the residence between Nixon and Mitchell. And then we're missing part of a April 15 reel that it just ran out. It didn't pick up automatically, which was very important in John's story because John went in to see Nixon on April 15. And John, this is that evening that you went to see him. He knew you were breaking. You go in to see him. He's got a pad, a yellow pad. It's at night. He's been drinking a little bit. He's been out on the Sequoia with B.B. Rebozo that day. But he calls you in to try and lead you through a series of questions. Could you describe that meeting on April 15? And the tape is missing from this.
Yeah, that's the meeting I testified to at the Senate that I believe I've been recorded. And I'm asked by Howard Baker, the vice chair, Republican vice chair of the committee, he keeps pressing, well, why do you think you were recorded? I said, well, first of all, it was very unlike like our typical conversations for Nixon to ask me leading questions. Leading questions like, John, you remember that conversation we had about a cancer on the presidency? Yes, I do. Do you remember you raised the fact that I asked you how much it could cost to pay these guys off? And you said $1 million, and I told you that'd be no problem. You knew I was joking, didn't you? I said, well, Mr. President, I didn't fully understand that at the time, but if that's what you say. Anyway, the conversation went like that, and at one point, he gets up from his chair, goes to the corner of the EOB office, and in a stage whisper says to me, he says, I was foolish to talk to Colson about clemency for Hunt, wasn't I? I said, yes, Mr. President, that was probably obstruction of justice. Well, that tape, that reel disappeared. When I did my book, The Nixon Defense, and started going through all of the conversations and listening to them, I found out that reel did not disappear. Steve Bull talks to Nixon about that reel being given to Fred Buzzard. Now, this is deep in the weeds minutia, But Jill, you appreciate what that means, that reel could be in somebody's attic today, that the machine did not malfunction. This is something that Lou Sims, the Secret Service agent who was in charge of the machinery, said, we just never got the reel back, and Buzzard told us that's what had happened, that the machines had malfunctioned, and we had to go with what he said.
So this first hearing of missing tapes, Jill is sitting there with Richard Benveniste. The kids were running the shop at that point, right?
Yes, there was a senior lawyer, Jim Neal, who had worked particularly with John, so John knows him quite well, or knew him quite well. And he left Washington to return to his brand new law firm in Nashville, Tennessee, right after John's plea. I rode in the car with Archie Cox to go to court for John's plea, and then Jim flew to the airport right after that, leaving Rick and I in charge. And the idea was, if we got an indictment, because this was very early on, that if we got an indictment, he would return to lead the trial team. So there were two of us. Rick was only a few years older than I am, so I had just turned 30. We were two kids against the White House. You know, it was the Children's March against the Wicked King, is what people had called us. And
so you have this hearing, and what you find is that Rick is taking one witness after the other. You finally take him out in the hall and say, listen.
Yes,
right?
I learned my lesson, if you remember, when I talked to Henry and said, look, I want a trial. I learned my lesson. So watching, and Rick was older, so he was more in charge than I was, but he wasn't that much older. And I called him out into the hallway between witnesses and said, Rick, I'm taking the next witness the White House calls, and then we're sharing equally after that. And he went, oh, okay. And the next witness called was Rosemary Woods. Now, that was the first hearing about the two missing ones. And there was...
Let me say one thing about that first hearing, because they're just bringing in these people to try and figure out what happened to these missing tapes. And Jill very prophetically asked Rosemary Woods, who is Nixon's secretary, about, and I'll read just from her book, this little section here. This is good. She said, you were cross-examining her, and you had no idea there was a gap, but you said, were there any precautions taken to assure you would not accidentally hit the erase button? I asked. Rose glared at me. Everybody said, be terribly careful, and I don't believe I am so stupid that they had to go over it and over it. I was told if you push that button, it will erase, and I think I used every possible precaution not to do that. By the way, she already knows about the gap when she's testifying here. What precautions, Jill Weinbanks asked, specifically did you take to avoid recording over it, thereby getting rid of what was already there? This turned out to be a prescient question, you wrote. What precautions, Rose snapped?
I used my head. It's the only thing I had. Is that not what it says?
Yeah, I used my head. It's the only one that I had. So, you know, she knows there's a gap.
Great for cross-examination at the second hearing.
Yeah. So we get into, we know there are two missing tapes. Then Nixon goes down to Florida to meet with, at Disney World of all places, and gives this speech, I am not a crook. You've all seen that, parts of that. Well, this is during that time when they're figuring out, now there's the 18.5-minute gap. And then a few days later after that speech, Judge Sirica, you see here in this with his, John thinks that's his law clerk.
Yeah, you know,
I know it's his law clerk.
Yeah, Todd Christopherson.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So they find out about the 18-minute gap. Well, now Sirica's going to have them come in to talk about that. This sets up Jill to come back to court, and this is
Normally, we would have investigated this in a grand jury, in secret, but Judge Sirica said, no, this is too important to the American people. They have to know what happened here. We're going to have, and he created this whole hearing scenario in a way, I mean, there was no such thing, but he just said, White House, you're going to call witnesses to prove that there's nothing nefarious here.
Yeah, it was
And
all a
that's-
show cause motion
Yeah.
on the subpoena because they were stonewalling, the subpoena. That's Leon Jaworski, by the way. Who's the guy in the middle?
Carl Feldbaum.
Okay.
And Carl Feldbaum, it's interesting because he has a science degree. And when it came time for me to go to the White House after the cross-examination in court of Rosemary, there was a debate who should go with me. I didn't want to go alone. And everybody said, oh, Carl, he's a scientist. Maybe he'll understand mechanical stuff. Now, he had a biology degree. But Carl is the one who went with me that day.
So same day, Rosemary Woods is brought in. She's extremely loyal to Nixon. She'd been with him since his
Congressional days.
Yeah, congressional
Well,
days.
actually, she started working for him when he became a senator, but she had worked for the committee that he was on when he was in Congress.
Right. And so this leads to the examination. I'll have Jill tell the examination that gets to the point where then Sirica allows you, this is extraordinary, to go to the White House with her and have her demonstrate at the White House.
Yes.
So,
So this is the second time questioning her. I had the whole weekend of Thanksgiving to not enjoy turkey and to prepare for this, but I was going to violate the first rule of every trial lawyer, which is you never ask a question you don't know the answer to. And I was going to have to start by saying, tell me what happened, Rosemary, or Miss Woods. And I also learned from John that she's actually called Rose. And so she gave this really strange story about I was doing this transcription, and you can see her typewriter, and next to that is the Eurer machine on which this supposed erasure happened. And she said the phone rang, and I answered it, and I must have, when I went to answer it, instead of hitting the stop, I hit the record, and I had this conversation, and when I came back, I realized that I had hit record, so I rewound, and I realized that there was this hum where the conversation should have been. I heard about Nevada, which was the last thing I remembered before I took the call, and then there was just this hum. And she said, but I also had to keep my foot on a pedal underneath my typing stand because that's what made the machine run. And if my foot wasn't on it, it wouldn't have done anything. It would have stopped. And she sort of, I said, well, could you demonstrate that? And she sort of starts to describe it, and we brought in the machine. We couldn't fit on the witness box both the typewriter and the recorder, so we had just the recorder. You know what size a witness box is. So it's balanced precariously, and she says, I had on my headphones, so she puts them on. I ask my next question, and she lifts her headphone up, sort of the type that John is wearing right now, and says, sorry, I couldn't hear you. So I said, okay, you're going to have to take those off so that you can answer my questions. We'll pretend like you're still wearing them. She puts them down, and then I asked, she says, well, the machine was on, so she presses it. And we have a blank tape on, obviously. We're not using the real thing. And the thing is going. Do you have a picture of the machine itself? Because,
no.
Oh, well, it's reel-to-reel, old-fashioned kind of thing. And it starts moving. I can see that. And I said, what happened next? She said, well, first I had to take off those. And she moves her hand just this much. And with that slight movement, her foot came off the pedal. And the tape stopped cold. No more revolutions. And I, not so calmly, kind of shrieked, and the tape isn't moving anymore. The jury box, which was filled with the press, fled the room to get to a bank of payphones. Again, no cell phones. So they're calling in the story. And she says, well, it was different in my office. I did it there. And I said, well, Your Honor, maybe we should adjourn to her office, never expecting that he would say, okay, and that the White House wouldn't say, absolutely not. But for some reason, the White House lawyers, okay, her lawyer, okay, because by this point, she was no longer represented by the White House. She had to hire her own lawyer, who, by the way, was a law school classmate and friend of Richard Nixon's. And so the next thing I knew, I was getting, the office actually had a car, and they drove me there, although there are pictures of me hailing a cab to return to the office because we didn't have cars that would wait for us. And so that picture that you showed was me trying to get a cab on Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yeah.
This one is one of the many cartoons that resulted from the Rosemary sketch.
It says she tried pushing a tape recorder button while holding her foot on a pedal and reaching back for a telephone.
And I got hundreds of letters from secretaries saying there's no way that could have happened, which was pretty obvious when her foot came off the pedal. I mean, if you go back to the evidence photograph, you can see she's got, oh, by the way, she had testified that it was her left foot on the pedal. And that becomes important because if any of you tries to demonstrate, and I'm not going to do it up here because I'm wearing a skirt instead of pants, but if you put your left foot out and try to reach back with that, as opposed to with your right foot, you can you can push the chair and move much more with your right foot on it. But she had testified in the first hearing earlier than this that it was her left foot, so she had to keep her left foot there. Now, there's no way that she kept her left foot and reached and talked on the phone, and you can see she's holding on for dear life with her right hand on the arm of the chair. It didn't happen. It just didn't happen that way. So there's a lot of sequences that come after that, which is, she said, I realized there was this gap. I made a horrible mistake. I watched on my phone for the president's phone to be disconnected. He was on the phone when it happened. And I ran right into the Oval Office, right next door. And I told him, and he said, oh, don't worry about it. It's not a subpoenaed tape, which is, of course, ludicrous and ridiculous. And why would he even know whether it was or wasn't? And, of course, my theory is that tape was the first one, and he, before agreeing that he would violate the Stennis compromise offer, that he was going to turn them over, he would want to listen to them. So you would ask for, okay, give me the first tape. And he listens, he goes, oh my God, that's terrible. So he erases a little, and then he listens more, and he erases. And we now know from experts that it wasn't one 18-and-a-half-minute erasure, it was 7 to 9 different erasures. So he listens, he erases, he listens more, he erases, he listens more, he erases. And then when she comes running in, he goes, oh, I have a patsy now. I can let her think she actually did it. He then calls Alexander Haig, who has replaced Haldeman as chief of staff. Alexander Haig, who said that it was a sinister force who may have erased the tape, and also said that he was in charge when he was Secretary of State, forgetting that there was, a lot of people like the Speaker of the House who preceded him in becoming president should something happen. And they go for a ride around Washington. Yeah. They get out of the White House. They don't go anywhere. They're just riding around and riding around. Now, Haig says that they were discussing the crimes of the Vice President, Agnew, and what would happen involving that. But I think they were talking about, Rosemary thinks she did it. Let's let her do it. And there's one other piece of information, which I did include in my book, and it was a tip I got from Bob Woodward, who I did not speak to during Watergate, but met subsequently as a result of another friend who's here who made me go up to him and say hello at an event that Roosevelt University was having. And when I got to know him and talk to him, he said, there was this one guy I talked to who told me that Haig was going around the White House asking for somebody to take the blame for the 18-and-a-half-minute gap. And I said, really? That's really interesting. He said, yeah, and the person happened to be Steve Bull, who is very involved. You've mentioned his name. He was the one who queued up where the conversations that were on the subpoena started, and so that Rose didn't have to go through the whole tape. She only had to listen to the exact conversation that was subpoenaed. And he was at an event with me, and he was like irate that he was asked to do that. And he said, I'm not going to do that. And Haig said, but this is what you could do for your commander-in-chief, which coming from a general sounds exactly right to me, sounds really believable. And so I think they were looking for a patsy, and she fell into it when she listened to a pre-erased tape, that she really didn't erase it. She may have erased some small part of it, and by the way, she said she was only on the phone for 4.5, 5, maybe 6 minutes. So how does that explain an 18-and-a-half-minute erasure? It just can't. So that's my theory, is that she didn't do it, that it was probably Nixon, maybe aided by Haldeman. Nixon was notoriously clumsy, and so it's unlikely that he could have manipulated the machines enough to have done it unaided.
All right, so we are at our witching hour here at 5:30. Nixon, subsequently resigns when the Supreme Court says that the tapes have to be turned over, and then, of course, Ford pardons him. So if you'll indulge us for just 2 more minutes, I do want to ask both you and John, what do you think about Ford's, and I'll start with John first, Ford's decision to pardon and what it means today to us?
Initially, my reaction was a little bit of outrage that was the only pardon. A lot of people were about to have to go to trial and what have you for Nixon. Then I thought about it. I said, it's understandable why he did it, because he couldn't govern and hope to govern without Watergate being a question he'd be confronted with every day. Because if Nixon were indicted, and that was a high likelihood, he would be having to make decisions about what evidence could and couldn't be turned over, what was executive privilege, what was not, was he drawing himself further into the scandal? So it was understandable, and it was certainly a humanitarian thing to do. So I had no problem with it. It's been in the years since, and I've read all the memos of the Special Prosecution Force arguing pro and con, the most powerful arguments being the fair trial issue. That's the one issue that has not been addressed with Trump. Now, how can you give a president a fair trial because of the visibility and what have you? I think a president can. I don't think that it's any different wasn't any different for Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell, and indeed that a president can be indicted just like his aides. So there shouldn't be some one exception that's above the law. So where I come down on the final count of it is that Ford made a mistake in doing it, and it was something that he should have figured out how to negotiate with the prosecutors, what evidence was needed, and Nixon should have stood trial.
Jill?
My answer is complicated, because I was one of those advocating for the indictment of the president while he was president. We failed in convincing Leon Jaworski that that should happen. He believed that impeachment was the only proper remedy for this. And in arguing that, he did agree with us on a compromise that allowed us to ask Judge Sirica for permission to turn over our evidence to the impeachment committee, the House Judiciary Committee. Rather than having them reinvent the wheel, we could give them tapes and an outline. We did not make conclusions, but we turned over things that showed very specific acts and what the evidence was. And so
It's the so-called roadmap.
The roadmap. It was a big briefcase that we turned over, and which Jim Doyle says I'm the one who named the roadmap, so I'm happy about that.
Yeah.
And it was an okay. Then he resigns, and I immediately went to Leon and said, okay, you said that you can't indict a sitting president because it could interfere with his being president. But he's not president, he's an ordinary citizen. And he argued with us, and we went back and forth, and there were memos. Not everybody felt as I did. And so while we were debating this, the pardon came down. You can imagine that I was irate and angry and didn't like Ford. I had already campaigned against Ford for president, or I eventually did, not then, but subsequently because of his role in the Wright-Patman episode. And he had tried to intervene in getting the FBI to stop the money chain, follow the money. And then I appeared on a panel, I don't know, many years ago in Grand Rapids at the Ford I can't remember if it's the museum or library, whatever's in Grand Rapids. And I met with his son and a man named Betten Becker, who was the one who delivered the offer of pardon to San Clemente to Nixon. And I was very touched and moved by, one, the insistence that Ford had on saying to Nixon, if you accept this, you are admitting your guilt. And there is a Supreme Court case that says that. And so that gave me some comfort, and by his son, who made a very clear case that this was something that Ford felt personally, deeply was the right thing to do. And so I sort of wavered on that. But now, fast forward to today, and I can't help but think that had he been held accountable, maybe we wouldn't be in the trouble we are now. Maybe democracy would not be so much at risk, and that holding a person accountable for what are clear crimes with clear and convincing evidence. I also worried back then whether a jury would acquit all of his co-conspirators, and he was named an unindicted co-conspirator in our indictment, even back before, while he was the sitting president. Although we didn't name him by name. That was put in a safe in Judge Sirica's office. I feel like it was the wrong thing to do. I think that it might help, and that you need to hold the guilty accountable, and that no one is above the law, including the president or the former president. So that's where I come out today.
Okay, good. So we are completed with our program. I think what we're going to do is, instead of having a Q&A here, because I think we want to have everybody be able to mingle and say hello and open the bar, Jill's going to sign books. We've got books. I've got some of my books to sign. So if you have questions for her, come up, give us those questions, and we will be happy to talk to you about that. I do want to have our managing partner, Debbie Reed, conclude this, but before she speaks, I just want to say, I've known these two for a decade, and they're both really American heroes, and it is really wonderful for us to have them here as our guests. We thank all of you for coming, but...
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. As Jim noted, I'm Debbie Reed, the firm-wide managing partner. What a fascinating program. I want to thank you all for coming, and on behalf of our firm, I want to thank our speakers. John Dean, who has collaborated us for years, delivering one interesting program after another. Jill Wine-Banks. Jill and I have only talked on the phone together, but Jim has been telling me about the greatness of Jill for years, and I see it's all true. And finally, our own Jim Robenalt, moderator extraordinaire, bringing his rich background as a political historian to the forefront today. I also want to thank quickly all the people responsible for putting together this program: Jim Robenalt, Stephen Block, Frank Chaikin, Georgine Davison, Jarita Evans, Katie Stice, and the very important Katie Egan. They are the rock stars that made today's event happen. Thank you very much. And just a few seconds between me and the bar, just a few announcements. If you are a lawyer and you want CLE credit, please be sure to stop at the registration table and fill out what you need to fill out in order to get that credit. You can also pick up a valet parking voucher at the registration table. Jim already said that he and Jill are kind enough to sign some books. They're going to be signing books for 15 or so minutes here. If you don't have the chance to pick up a book this evening, we will mail you a book written by one of our three speakers, so be certain to drop off your business card at the registration table. And so now it's our pleasure to invite you to join us for a reception. It's set up to my right and in the back of the room. We have some hors d'oeuvres and drinks and some specialty cocktails, the Cover Up Collins and Follow the Money Margarita. Thanks again for joining us.